Get 3 coffins ready, kid, because our latest podcast, Make My Day, is venturing off into the wild and sprawling frontier that is Clint Eastwood's career. More movies than Stephen King has books, and more genres than all of the franchises we've covered over at the Halloweenies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Do they really need to start another show? Well, to tell you the truth, in all this excitement, I kind of lost track myself. But being this is a podcast, the most powerful medium in the world for pop culture conversation, and Clint's output is infinite, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do ya, punk? Find out today and subscribe to Make My Day, a Clint Eastwood podcast now, wherever you get your audio.
Carry on and plan the sequel, because let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel.
And welcome back to Microqueers. It's our queer horror movie roundup, and I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace, and we are finally discussing Hammer Horror's Dr. Jekyll, the one with Eddie or Suzy Izzard, depending on your preference, with a trans Dr. Jekyll.
Yeah, so before we hit record, we were discussing how it feels like we've been waiting for this one for a while, so it's nice to finally get a chance to talk about it. But Trace, in our true style of Patreon conversations about new horror releases, we tend to start with a, do you recommend this title, and will you remember this title? So why don't we start off with recommend?
I'm sorry to say this is a no for me. I mean, like, I didn't hate watching it, but I wouldn't recommend this to anyone. But a big part of it is I don't think I'm going to remember this come December.
Okay. Yeah. You know what? I think that that's probably fair. I don't think that this is a slam dunk. I do believe I liked it a little bit more than you, so this is a very soft recommend for me, if only because at the end of the day, I did really like the 2 lead performances. I just think the rest of the film does, it's a touch underwhelming. And will I remember this? I mean, here's the thing. I think it's a fun role for Suzy Izzard, and I'm happy that she got to do this, and I'm happy for the switch. I just, wish the film had taken a bigger swing.
Yeah, it's more of a thing where I will remember the fact that there was a Dr. Jekyll movie featuring a transgender Dr. Jekyll, like that existed, but nothing about this movie I will remember. That's kind of my thing, and that's my issue. And honestly, maybe this is a case of I wanted this movie to do one thing and it didn't do that thing, and so I'm kind of in that like expectations game that we sometimes find ourselves in, right?
Sure. Yeah, I'm with you. I am going to lay a lot of the blame on writer Dan Kelly-Mulhern. This feels uninspired. Like, everybody knows Doctor Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so we're just going to introduce this novel twist of making the doctor trans, and from that, money. And I don't mean to sound very glib about it. It just feels like so little work was done to tell an interesting story here. And it's really frustrating for me because we know what Izzard can do. We've seen her, like, I'm thinking of that really juicy role that she had, I want to say, in the 2nd and 3rd seasons of Hannibal. And, like, she's a dynamic performer, so the film leans on that. I think director Joe Stevenson does a decent job of keeping this moving. Like, it's quite brief, but at the end of the day, apart from the performances, there's just nothing really here. Like, I was struggling to even remember what is this film about, and I only watched it a couple days ago.
That's the thing. So I'll even just say what I was wanting from this. So, if you hear Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's a trans one. Aren't you kind of expecting that, like, it's going to be kind of this gender identity story where maybe Mr. Hyde, or Mrs. Hyde in this case, is, like, the female side of Dr. Jekyll, and then, like, Dr. Jekyll's the male side, and it's about, like, this warring of the two genders in them as they try to come to terms with their own identity. And this is very much no, it's just Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that happens to be trans. And so I just found that, yeah, as you said, not very inspiring. It felt very lazy to me, or I guess our favorite term, a missed opportunity.
Yes, and I'm sure because there are several folks who are screaming, it sounds like what you expected was Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde,
yes.
Which we will talk about in a full-length episode. We do have an editorial on it on Bloody, so that is a great film, and that is not what this film is interested in doing. What's interesting is we keep referring to this as, oh, it's a trans take on the story, and part of the reason, folks, you may be like, oh, well, is that really what they're doing, or did they just cast a trans actress? And it's right here in the opening credits. So we're getting newspaper headlines about trans CEO Nina Jekyll. So the film canonically recognizes that Nina Jekyll is a trans woman.
Yeah.
And then, we lay out our story where we've got this character who has fallen on hard times. He's an ex-con. He can't get a job. He's got a sick infant. He's got a drug-addicted ex and all this stuff. And you're like, okay, so we're doing stuff. He goes to work for her. He's a caregiver for her. Shady shit is happening. We all know where this is going because we know Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then there's one other moment where we get this weird flashback, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but we see that Nina Jekyll is played by a young girl. So I was like, wait, is she trans then? Because this is a girl. Like, are we meant to believe that she transitioned at like age 8?
I mean, that may be the idea. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't really delve into this. So it's one of those things where it's like, we talk about, okay, what types of like queer stories do we want? There's two big ones, where it's about their queerness or where it's a quote unquote regular story that happens to have a queer character in it. And this one takes the latter approach. But I agree with you. I was also very confused about that flashback. Love seeing Jonathan Hyde as the original Mr. Hyde. That was really inspired. Even though he has not even like a scene, it's a single shot in this movie, I think, is what he has.
Yes, and folks, if you don't know who that is, he's like the old curmudgeon-y dude from Anaconda, who's the narrator of the documentary.
Westridge.
Chef's kiss. Great character actor.
Great
Nothing
character
to do
actor.
Here.
But I did appreciate something like the on-the-nose aspect of Rob's full name being Robert Louis Stevenson.
Oh my God. I did think that was funny. Yeah.
But we've talked about how we are not Hammer experts. We've covered a couple Hammer horror films in the podcast, but we're not like super well versed in them. I was under the impression that some of the gothic style of Hammer horror was a really important part. And you do get that in parts of this movie, specifically towards the climax and as we have more night scenes. But so much of this is filmed in broad daylight with like vast rays of sunlight coming through the windows, which I think was an intentional stylistic choice. But to me, it kind of makes everything look cheap, which, to be fair, I do think this was a cheap production.
Oh, sure. Yeah. This is nearly a shot in a single location. The house is big, but even then, it feels like we're only using a couple of rooms. There's the dining room, there's the room where we play chess, and then there's a couple of bedroom scenes. So, yeah, this is definitely low budget. It's independent, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a dirty term. I was less off-put by the sunlight, if only because in a lot of scenes, and again, maybe this is just me misremembering, but it felt like we were often getting chiaroscuro lighting, so it felt like we were doing odes to film noir, or even, the light is being cut up by darkness, kind of like Jekyll and Hyde. But even if that is the case, this isn't a particularly moody film. As I mentioned, I think Stevenson is doing okay work. There's some fun shots as Nina is smoking her cigarette and the end glows green, which I thought was a bit of a novel twist. But again, it's kind of not explained. Like, the film is resolutely disinterested in actually exploring the Jekyll and Hyde. It feels more like, oh, we can use this as a bit of a twist that Nina was actually Rachel Hyde for most of the film and she actively knew what was going on. And I'm like, okay, I guess.
Okay, that's also what I was really confused by. So yes, the film presupposes that you already know the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I get it. It's a really, really famous tale. But we aren't addressing the fact that there is a Mrs. Hyde, Rachel Hyde, until the actual reveal in the final 10 minutes of the movie. So to me, it kind of makes the first hour feel kind of meandering in a way.
Yeah, like there isn't quite enough juice. And I'll admit, there's one other character we haven't really talked about who is significant, I would argue, because we do cast a fairly well-known British actor in Lindsay Duncan, who plays the estate manager, Sandra. So this is the woman that Rob is interviewed by, and they immediately do not hit it off. It's clear that Sandra is there to make sure that Nina gets her pills on time, that the cameras keep working, all of the, regulatory stuff that would keep a Hyde figure in check, right? So we know that Sandra's gonna go at some point. That death, we don't even see. I didn't even know that she was dead until it's like, oh, we're just not bringing her back for the rest of the film. There's a scuffle that we hear.
I thought she just left.
So that is not great in terms of visual storytelling, but also it's weird to me that we get rid of her so early, because it would have made more sense to keep her around for the conflict, particularly if we aren't going to do more with this. Nina seems to have this double-sided personality to her.
Well, because unfortunately we have to make way for this other subplot that I could not give two shits about.
Oh, no.
Which is Rob's ex-wife / baby mama Maeve, played by Robin Cara, who is constantly threatening him to, turn one over on Dr. Jekyll and steal all of her money.
Right.
To, get money and also, fund treatment for his daughter who has leukemia. Spoiler alert, that girl dies by the end of this movie.
Okay, it's so bizarre. So, yeah, Maeve is definitely a drug addict. There's an insinuation that Rob got her hooked on drugs, and then he took the fall for criminal activity that they were conducting with other people. He went to jail. He got clean. He's trying to get his life back together to help raise the baby, who we will never see. We just hear about. Yeah. And Maeve stayed drug addicted and so on. She doesn't come off particularly bad, except, she shows up and says, hey, let's pull a heist on your new employer. And we all know that this is going to go very badly. It's so similar to a bunch of other horror films. I mean, see Exhibit A, Abigail, from earlier this year.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's the thing where it's like, we have this 89-minute movie with, again, a main conflict in what should be Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, but then we also have Sandra, who is kind of antagonistic, is antagonistic, and then we also have this plot with Maeve and, as will be revealed, Rob's brother, Ewan, played by Morgan Watkins, who is in cahoots with Maeve, but
who could care? And everybody saw the twist coming.
No, but here's the thing, though, and I'll just rush us to this climax, because I like seeing Suzy Izzard get to kind of play in the sandbox, but aren't you a little disappointed we don't get any makeup work done on Rachel Hyde?
Yeah, again, I don't know if this is a bit of a budgetary constraint. It's really just leaving the performance up to Izzard, and I do think that she builds it in intensity. The moment where she and Rob have drinks and play chess, and she's kind of seductive and commanding. I did like that, and I hoped that we were going to see more of it. The problem is it's basically that scene, and then the end when, Rachel Hyde is allowed to kind of come out and play, and we're just beating Maeve and the other people to death. We're just shooting you in. It all feels so compacted, and I don't know why we waited for so long. If, you're right, we're treating the rest of the film as, oh, you know the story. Okay, well, if we know the story, then get us there faster. Let us live in the implications. But instead, this becomes a weird body hop movie.
And it becomes one, and then it's over, because this is an 89-minute movie. And so, know, I hate saying a film is boring, but because of everything you just said, that's kind of what it is for me. I appreciate aspects of this. I like seeing Suzy Izzard get to play in this sandbox, but again, she barely gets any time to do it before the credits roll.
Yeah, I mean, I do think she's kind of camping it up in the non-showy earlier parts of the film. She is a delight to watch because she's clearly having a pretty good time with it. I do think her chemistry with Rob Scott Chambers, who, as a completely bizarre sidebar, I wrote to you, it was like, this is one of the executive producers of the Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey movies. This actor has 114 producing credits to his name. He looks like he's 15 years old.
Yeah, but they're all those types of films, because I looked at it too, because it's also a lot of those public domain horror movies.
but I like the playful, seductive combativeness of Izzard and Chambers. And I was never bored. I just kept waiting for the movie to do something that reflected their intensity or their dedication to it. Like, I enjoyed the performances. It did feel a little bit stagey, if only because we weren't doing too much with the direction and it was the single location. But I was like, okay, so when are we going to pick this up? And the movie just never really picks it up.
Well, and that's honestly, because I think one of the standout sequences before the climax is that chess scene, because we're watching the two actors that are carrying this film.
Yes.
Fire, I don't even want to say fire on all cylinders, because it's not even that exciting of a scene, but it's at least compelling and involving in a way that some of these other scenes aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, like you finish the movie and you say, oh, well, I hope that they had back insurance because they were carrying that whole fucking movie on.
Yeah, I know it's so cliche to say that, but like that's honestly how it feels. So I don't know. I mean, overall, this, I was gonna say it's fine. It's a little less than fine for me, but mostly because when you say trans Dr. Jekyll movie, yes, you're right. I guess Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde immediately comes to mind. And that was in the 70s. So I'm like, okay, well, what does a 2024 trans Dr. Jekyll story look like? And this isn't really what I pictured.
No, it definitely doesn't feel adventurous and contemporary. And considering that this is really Hammer's return to horror in a big way, you know, we haven't made a Hammer film in a long time. So here we go. We're back to it. And this is a pretty understated return. So I think if folks are at all curious just to see what Izzard does with the performance in that capacity, I would say, sure, yeah, give it a look. You know, if this doesn't sound at all compelling to you, I don't unfortunately think you're missing much aside from those performances.
Yeah, I do want to offer a tiny, gentle correction. So while you were right that Hammer hasn't done a ton of horror recently, in the past decade, they have come in with Let Me In, the Let the Right One In remake, both Woman in Black films, and 2019's The Lodge.
Right. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So more of the Hammer films that we came to expect from like the 70s, where it was, you know, castles and Dracula and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. This feels more in line with classic Hammer in a way that many of those other films I just listed weren't. And yeah, just it doesn't hit the mark for me, unfortunately. So, I mean, again, check it out if you're curious, but this wouldn't be a recommend for me.
Okay. Well, folks, if you checked it out, let us know. We're curious to hear your thoughts. Or maybe you have other recommendations where you can say, oh, yeah, you know, we cast a trans actor and then we fucking ran with it. Let us know.
Hopefully we see more films like that coming forward. But
sure.
Until then, everyone, we can cross out Dr. Jekyll.
Indeed. And cross out microqueers.
Get 3 coffins ready, kid, because our latest podcast, Make My Day, is venturing off into the wild and sprawling frontier that is Clint Eastwood's career. More movies than Stephen King has books, and more genres than all of the franchises we've covered over at the Halloweenies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Do they really need to start another show? Well, to tell you the truth, in all this excitement, I kind of lost track myself. But being this is a podcast, the most powerful medium in the world for pop culture conversation, and Clint's output is infinite, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do ya, punk? Find out today and subscribe to Make My Day, a Clint Eastwood podcast now, wherever you get your audio.